Welcome to today's program titled OSHA Enforcement and Policy Shifts. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. For those of you who are logged into the web presentation, you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the program by typing them into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. For those interested in obtaining CLE credit for this webinar, a CLE attendance verification code will be read later in the presentation. Please write this code down as it will not be reread and is required on the CLE credit request form. During the presentation, you will see a slide with the QR code that you may scan to access and submit your request for CLE credit. You can also find a link to the form in the connection detail email you received this morning. Copies of the webinar recording and materials will be distributed to all attendees in the days following the webinar. On the next slide, you will see a legal disclaimer. This presentation has been prepared by Seyfarth Shaw LLP for informational purposes only. The material discussed during this webinar should not be construed as legal advice or a legal opinion on any specific facts or circumstances. The content is intended for general information purposes only, and you are urged to consult a lawyer concerning your own situation and any specific legal questions you may have. At this time, I would like to turn it over to our first speaker for today's program, Melissa Ortega. Melissa, please go ahead.
Thank you, Donna. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Melissa Ortega. I'm an associate in the Workplace Safety and Environmental Group here at Seyfarth Shaw, and I'm here with my colleague, Dan Birnbaum. He's a partner in the same group. Just a quick note, we did have our colleague and partner, Ben Briggs, listed in the invite that you all received, but he had a last-minute conflict, so he will not be able to join us, but rest assured that we will be giving you the full program here today. We have a short but informative program for you today. If you have any questions or if we can help you with anything, please feel free to reach out to us. We'll be sharing our contact information and, as Donna mentioned, the CLE code here at the end. Next slide, please. On today's agenda is an update on OSHA's leadership, anticipated changes, and emerging enforcement issues. Next slide, please, Donna. Next slide, please. President Trump nominated Lori Chavez as the Secretary of Labor. She's known to have an evolving political stance. But during her confirmation hearings, she did affirm that her job would be to implement President Trump's policy vision. There are 9 Assistant Secretaries of Labor. The Assistant Secretary of Labor for OSHA oversees OSHA, obviously, and that includes setting workplace safety and health standards, which state programs then must meet or exceed. The Assistant Secretary of Labor for OSHA also designs and implements enforcement policies and programs and manages OSHA's multi-million-dollar budget, among a number of other things that will, for sure, affect employers and employees alike. On February 11th, President Trump nominated David Keeling as the Assistant Secretary of Labor for OSHA. His nomination is currently pending in the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. He is expected to be confirmed there, but a date has not been announced for his confirmation hearings. David Keeling is a workplace safety veteran. He worked in safety and health at UPS, according to his LinkedIn, for almost 3 decades. Where he worked his way through safety leadership roles all the way up to VP of Global Health and Safety. Keeling later worked for Amazon as a director of global road and transportation safety, and later opened his own health and safety consultant firm where he worked up until his nomination just a couple of months ago. In the safety and health industry, Keeling has a reputation for being practical when it comes to safety and health. Both the business community and unions have praised and some have supported his nomination. Here at Seyfarth, we anticipate that Keeling will bring a more pro-employer orientation than President Biden's OSHA, which was led by Doug Parker. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Doug Parker was the former head of California OSHA. Under Doug Parker's leadership, we saw enforcement focus on what have been priorities in California. So that included heat illness, vulnerable worker populations, and workplace violence. Under Biden and Doug Parker, federal OSHA established many national emphasis programs, some which targeted enforcement of heat hazards under the General Duty Clause. OSHA later developed the heat illness rule applicable to the general industry and construction in April 2024, so a year ago. OSHA is currently still considering stakeholders' comments, but it remains to be seen how long OSHA under Trump and Keeling will consider the comments and or whether it will publish the final rule at all. Under Biden, we also saw a focus on construction with the National Emphasis Program to eliminate injuries and fatalities associated with falls, and a focus on warehouses and retail backrooms with the National Emphasis Program on warehousing and distribution center operations. We saw, and we did see significant program inspections under both of these programs. We also saw union-friendly rules, and that included OSHA's third-party walk-around rule, which broadened the grounds for when OSHA compliance officers can use their judgment to determine when a third-party representative, for example, a union rep, can join a walk-around inspection. Next slide, please, Donna. Under Biden, we also saw an uptick in press releases, so shaming employers with these press releases. And they announced injuries and citations of many employers across the country. We also saw an uptick in the severe violator enforcement program, and that allowed OSHA to concentrate its resources on inspecting employers that they believe have demonstrated indifference to the act by committing willful, repeated, or failure to evade violations. Employers who were added to the program's list are on there for 3 years. And added to a log that is made public. So again, shaming employers. OSHA also focused on repeats and willfuls and used employer knowledge of a previous inspection to justify a willful classification of a citation. Under Biden, we also saw an uptick in the use of the General Duty Clause and enhanced referrals to the DOJ for criminal prosecution in fatality cases. And lastly, under Biden, we saw targeted enforcement of record-keeping violations and an increased request for employer root cause analysis and insurance audits. Next, Dan will talk about the projections for the agency under Trump's second term and with David Keeling at the helm. Next slide, please, Donna.
Thanks, Melissa. Appreciate that. Just want to set the table here before we jump into what we expect to see. Obviously, it's a somewhat unique situation because we have, she's for the first time in probably 100 years, a president that's not serving consecutive terms. So we really have the ability now to understand what his priorities were during his first administration. And as Melissa just recounted for us, how it sort of swung when the Biden administration took office and now where it might be heading. But I think it's worth it to take just a few minutes to have a look back from 2016 to 2020, understanding where Trump was then, because we think it'll shed a light on where he's headed here. So during his first administration, pretty flat budgets for the first 2 years. I think Trump may stand alone as going through his entire first term without having any confirmed head of OSHA. He had nominated Scott Mugno, a similar sort of nominee who had a career working for corporate entities in the safety sector, and that sat dormant for about 2 years before Mr. Mugno withdrew his nomination, and then the president never nominated anybody else, and the agency, sat vacant without a head for the entire 4 years of his term. I think interesting too is that Trump waited until about November of his first year before he made the nomination, whereas here we're seeing the nomination come a lot earlier, which may signal that maybe he has a little bit more of an agenda with OSHA, or at least wants to have his people put in there a little bit earlier now. I mean, as we're obviously all aware, at the end of his term, which came at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, OSHA played a very significant role, obviously, in everybody's daily lives. And so it may have put the agency more on President Trump's map, so to speak, which may be why this is occurring the way it is. So no confirmed OSHA leadership, at least during his first tenure. A declining number of OSHA compliance officers, which is significant because OSHA compliance officers are obviously the boots on the ground, day-to-day folks who are going around and enforcing OSHA compliance. And so part of you wants to say, well, if there's a declining number of these compliance officers, that may mean there's less inspections. And as you'll see, there were a declining number of inspections as the second bullet point hits. But the trade-off is that now with compliance officers only able to oversee so many work sites and go out and see so many folks, sometimes paradoxically, it may lead to an uptick of the amount of citations that are issued, or OSHA trying to get more, so to speak, bang for their buck. If they can't get out to as many sites, then the sites that they do get out to may get a heavier sort of look from OSHA in that regard. The other part of this too is that to fill the gap of a declining number of compliance officers, new folks are being brought on board. And as is the case in any organization that brings on new personnel, they may not have the same sort of training. They may be a little bit more zealous. They may take a different approach, a non-traditional approach to how they enforce OSHA standards. And so in that regard, having a great influx of new OSHA compliance officers, if that's the case, or losing the more veteran ones, can lead to sort of a little bit of additional exposure for employers in that regard. So, although it can bode well for the regulated community, a declining number of OSHA compliance officers in practice can also somewhat lead the other way. During the first administration as well, he did issue some new national emphasis programs, some that are still in place, and new regulations. So we wouldn't expect to see a complete pause on rulemaking or where emphasis programs are. I think we'll talk about some we think that will be on the chopping block, or at least that we would be surprised to see them enforced. But at least at this point, I don't think it's a complete pause or hold on OSHA from a rulemaking standpoint, or obviously from an enforcement standpoint. And then obviously a very significant part of the first Trump administration, as well as everyone's lives, was the pandemic and a focus on complaints. And if nothing else, the pandemic really opened the eyes of the everyday worker to understand, hey, if I'm unhappy and I think my workplace is unsafe, I can pick up the phone and call OSHA. And there's not much, unless the administration could get rid of that process, which is something we don't anticipate. There's not much the administration can do to limit, sort of the knowledge now, the institutional knowledge that the workforce has in terms of how OSHA operates and what they can do to get OSHA involved at the work site. So a large part of the administration was focused on those complaints, and that's sort of been a process that we've seen carry over in this post-COVID world, where employees are better aware of their ability to file these complaints and OSHA's ability to come out and investigate. There was some limited employer-friendly policy changes from the Trump administration for post-accident drug testing. The Trump administration issued guidance regarding how incentive programs can work and how post-accident drug testing can be conducted, sort of making it a little bit more employer-friendly on that front for both of those items, and to date at least hasn't significantly been revoked, and we would anticipate under this administration that same guidance would be given the backing of OSHA and a similar stance from the agency. Also, policy change regarding wellness programs and an openness to the OSHA's VPP program to sort of award employers that they find to be good actors in that regard, and how that operates. So with the table set for the first Trump administration, we want to sort of get to the second half of this sort of short presentation here, the meat and bones of what we wanted to talk about today, of where we anticipate all of this heading. Next slide, please. So our projections for the leadership coming up, based on where we were and where we're going, is obviously, as Melissa's noted, having new leadership in place with more cooperative orientation. So as of right now, as we're seeing day to day, we have cases in different jurisdictions that may be taking somewhat of a scattershot approach, and not sort of a uniform approach here. I'll give you an example of a case I have right now, out of Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. Traditionally, as folks on the phone who may have participated in an OSHA investigation are aware, inspection, OSHA can interview individuals, and there's a question of whether those interviews can be recorded or not. And this has sort of been a perpetual battle where ultimately it usually falls out on the employer side, saying that that they can't be, that they're voluntary interviews and employees have a right not to be interviewed. I have a case now, a whistleblower case in Pennsylvania, that involves an OSHA office that is now sort of standing alone and taking the position that interviews can be recorded, and not only so much as taking the position, but have now gone to court and have taken on a battle for the last 4 months in trying to determine whether they have a legal right to record them, and are getting case law that suggests that, yeah, we're going to order that you can record these interviews. And this sort of office here stands alone, but without any sort of universal direct guidance from an upper leadership. We are taking cases, and that's just one example, but in one region where how OSHA is enforcing it is different than how it occurs in other states or cities or regions, I should say, across the country. And in that regard, certainly you're going to see certain sections of the country federally, right? And there's obviously state plan states, we'll talk about that too, but federally who are acting sort of not in alignment with how other offices are acting. And as you might expect, they come from areas that may not have voted for the president or politically may stand apart from him. So in that regard, I think getting certainly all the federal offices in line under a uniform and approached orientation is going to be a goal, and where we anticipate that the administration is heading. Obviously, the head is not in place yet, so the scattershot approach continues, but we would anticipate as a uniform approach will come into place when leadership is put into place for OSHA. The other thing we're seeing, and seeing a lot of, actually every week we seem to hear about another case, is potential elimination or merger or relocation of both the Federal Department of Labor, but also of actual OSHA field offices. So out here in Chicago, we have numerous field offices, and are starting to get word here that, for example, I believe the Naperville area office, we have understood the actual brick and mortar facility is shutting down, along with others in the area, and consolidating to a single building. Obviously seeing the brick and mortar buildings, close down and be absorbed into one is just an example, but we anticipate too and understand from our contacts that certain career individuals at OSHA we've started to see walk out the door, and anticipate that may continue. So seeing in practice, not just from the brick and mortar aspect, but you think about the other resources OSHA has, whether it's to conduct inspections via drones or just the sort of technical ability they have to conduct inspections. I think we would start to see some of their resources shrink, which will obviously shrink their ability to conduct more inspections or conduct more comprehensive inspections if they don't get the equipment or materials that they need to do so. And so we're starting to already see that, and would anticipate that that's going to continue. In line also, the Flat and reduced budgets, which we saw in the first term, I think is something we would expect. The fewer co-shows and inspections, something we've already talked about happening during the first term, and the liabilities that open through that we would expect happening in this administration as well too, this term. We would anticipate seeing more cooperative program resources. So OSHA offers the ability to consult with businesses sort of free of charge. And traditionally, there was a lot of risk with that because, OSHA can come on site. They don't deal with what you deal day to day. They don't understand your operational abilities, economic feasibility, administrative feasibility, and may come in and suggest you make a change that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to implement and would strain your resources in a way that they couldn't understand. And so traditionally, you saw a lot of hesitation from companies somewhat to engage these services because, OSHA can make recommendations, and then if you don't adopt them, then they're going to say that, you needed to and could hold you against it moving down the road. But if we see more pro-employer or more business-friendly sort of operations and enforcement from OSHA, it could make sense that it swings the other way. And now it's advantageous to bring OSHA on site, if for nothing else to say, yeah, everything you're doing is compliant. Everything that's in place right now doesn't violate the act. And now you sort of have an affirmative statement from OSHA that you can use almost as a sword down the road if need be. So, depending on how the new leadership works, the sorts of interpretation letters that are issued by OSHA, the sort of compliance directives that are issued by OSHA, if they show a significant, pro-business, pro-employer sort of bent, then we would anticipate these sort of services that OSHA has offered in the past that traditionally have not been used greatly may become pretty valuable to employers and something employers might want to start considering using. Another thing we're starting to anticipate is probably less emphasis programs and programmed inspection activity. OSHA, the way they conduct inspections, for those on the phone who aren't aware, there's a hierarchy where obviously if there's a serious catastrophe, fatality, similar event, those get prioritized, and then it sort of bumps down if there's an amputation, then maybe if there's a complaint, and then if they have nothing else going on, essentially they have these emphasis programs where they'll go around, say, to warehouses or whoever else might be on those lists and inspect based on that. I think our anticipation is we're probably going to see less of that. They're going to prioritize the higher ups, and generally, if your business doesn't have a fatality or reportable sort of incident or isn't receiving a lot of complaints, we would be surprised if OSHA is inspecting those sorts of facilities, especially in line too with the fact that they have fewer compliance officers, because as is, they are extremely stretched, and it would take something like, I think, 150 years for them to get around and inspect every single company that falls under their jurisdiction, and they simply don't have the time for that. So given the strain in resources, I think it would be sensible that they're not going to place an emphasis on inspecting those sorts of employers. And then finally, I think what we would project is a reduced emphasis on whistleblower or anti-retaliation claims, and trying to get them resolved sooner. And I will say that just from my experience so far, it does seem like there's a big push here now. Cases that sat dormant or that were open during the Biden administration, you're seeing the investigators come out and almost make a push to resolve or solve the claim if possible, because I think their resources most likely are strained for being able to enforce or enforce those sorts of claims. Excuse me. Next slide, please. So some other projections we have with less emphasis on national emphasis programs, the focus will likely be on egregious or willful offenders, and what we would anticipate is the limited penalties for first-time offenders, potential exemptions for small businesses. And I think we've talked about already the rulemaking, how it worked out in the first administration. Our anticipation in the second administration would be limited rulemaking. Part of this too is this upcoming heat illness rule that's been in effect and has been highly talked about for years now, and that we're seeing more of in a general duty sense in the workplace as well, and from a rulemaking standpoint. Our sense is that rulemaking, first of all, takes many years to be put into place. But our sense on the heat illness rule is that the current administration is not going to be pushing it forward. And we wouldn't be surprised, honestly, if it sort of came to a screeching halt under this administration, if not completely axed, if possible. And then in line with that, heat illness being traditionally enforced under the general duty clause, seeing less of that enforced as well, or coming out of the area offices once a head is put into place. I think the general consensus for the industry, meaning the OSHA practitioners who do this, is almost universal that this administration is not going to be heavily enforcing that or pushing for it to be enforced, as well as trying to promulgate a rule that enforces it. So that is not to say, that it's an issue that should be ignored by employers, obviously, because outside of OSHA liability, there exists a lot of other sorts of liability that can result from heat illness. Would still obviously be our recommendation that employers treat the heat illness as a serious condition and take the steps generally that they would be taking to address these issues. But in terms of strict OSHA enforcement, I think it's likely that sort of liability or exposure is going to be less under this administration. And similarly, workplace violence, we see similarly. Again, an emerging issue. I think that the temperature of the workplace has risen, no pun intended, coming off of heat illness, but in terms of workplace violence, at least. And so we see this a lot more often as well. So obviously, taking steps necessary to address workplace violence, doing what needs to be done is of paramount importance. But at the same time, from an OSHA liability standpoint, we would see reduced. And something I want to mention that's not on this slide, but I think is very important, is that all of this is aimed at federal OSHA, but there are still roughly half of the states who enforce via their state OSHA state plan states. And I'm thinking obviously of California, Washington State, Oregon, Michigan, even now I have one in Vermont. And what we're seeing is, because we're anticipating, and the general thrust of this is that federal OSHA may scale back, what we're seeing is that state agencies, and especially states that did not necessarily vote for the president or whose politics may stand contrary to his, we are seeing a big uptick of enforcement in those states, sort of as a blowback or pushback, understanding that federal enforcement is down. We are now seeing states engage in increased rulemaking, increased enforcement. And so for those of you who operate in state plan states, and especially in those sorts of states that may have, gone for the other candidate, I think, what the takeaway from here is sort of a 180 is to expect the increased rulemaking, increased enforcement. New York State has new workplace violence rules going into place this year. California had a huge new workplace violence rule that went into effect of July last year that's being enforced. Minnesota has new ergonomic requirements that have gone into effect recently. I mean, every single state seems to be increased rulemaking and increased enforcement. So the big takeaway here is go back, look at your state plan states, and understand if you have operations there's going to be possibly increased enforcement there. And a withdrawal of the walk-around rule. And I have about a minute left here. I want to get to our last slide very quickly here, please. But next slide, please. Yes, thank you. Talking about sort of the court opinions that have come out, so everyone may be aware of a significant landmark decision this past year, scaling back on Chevron deference. Another case from a few years back, staying OSHA's ability to implement a COVID-19 vaccine mandate, excuse me. And so, the role of the courts here, I don't think can be understated. I think litigation can be likely, and litigation has proven to be more pro-employer friendly, less OSHA friendly in that regard. And something to be aware of, that litigation is likely to result There's a new Department of Government Efficiency looking at cutting wasteful spending. Of course, it remains to be seen what wasteful spending that will be as it applies to OSHA, but that's something to keep in our back minds. And I think we have seen brick and mortar places close down. And then finally, the Project 2025 that's been discussed to limit new regulations and seeing if there may be interpretation letters, compliance directors that may scale back sort of certain regulations and how OSHA enforces them. I want to read out the CLE code because there's credit for that. So next slide, please. So if everyone has their phone or is able to get out their phone, we'll leave this up here for a few minutes here. But the verification code is SS as in Seyfarth Shaw 5101. Again, that verification code for those seeking CLE credit is SS as in Seyfarth Shaw 5101. And we are now officially 1 minute over our allotted time. So I appreciate everyone sticking with us here and joining. If you ask questions, we'll try to respond to that. But want to thank everyone for taking some time from their lunch, if it's the lunch hour for you like it is here in Chicago, and joining us today. And please reach out if you have any questions. We'll leave this up for another minute or so and then roll it over to our contact information on the last slide. But again, thank you everybody for joining us and we appreciate it. So hopefully you've gotten the code. We'll push it over to the next slide then, which will give us our contact info. But thank you again, and we'll hope to talk to you soon. So, or see you again. So thank you very much.